new study from Johns Hopkins University has found lockdowns had little to no effect on COVID mortality rates, yet had devastating effects on economies and numerous social ills. Hate to say I told you so. Well, in fact, the study's author agrees that mandates and shutdowns actually created substantial harm. They concluded, quote, lockdowns should be rejected out of hand as a pandemic policy instrument. The analysis from Johns Hopkins shows that lockdowns early on in the pandemic reduced COVID mortality by about only 0.2%. And found that in some situations, they found some evidence that limiting gatherings was counterproductive and increased COVID mortality, interestingly enough. So what they found was that, when people were forced to stay home, if somebody was sick, then they were infecting their entire family. And also one of the issues with the lockdowns was that when college students, so they were, remember, telling college students to go back home. Well, college students living amongst young college students are not really at risk. We know this now. We really kind of knew this then, but we definitely know this now that they're very low risk. So a 20-something-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old college student is much lower risk than when they go home and they're around their older family members. So when you send all the college kids back home, what did you kind of expect to happen when then they were maybe infected and then they go home to their parents and they've got a hypertensive father or grandparents who live with them? It's disastrous. So this was very problematic. This study from Johns Hopkins shows that there was really no reduction in mortality, 0.2%. That is not worth it. They concluded that there was just way too many other ramifications from this. The study did find, however, that the closure of non-essential businesses saw a more significant benefit and reduced the mortality rate by about 10%, so 10.6%, which they say is likely related to the closure of bars, which is interesting. And so I would say bars probably because you drink, you start shouting, you get real close to each other, you have to talk real loud, right? And you have to get right up in each other's faces and you're spraying all of your saliva all over the person next to you. And so bars would be a place with high levels of spread. So they did find that, and people of all ages go to bars. And a lot of older people, people that are retired, they spend time in bars. That is one of the big issues I've had with these vaccine mandates is, why are you mandating all of these younger people to get the vaccine when the people who are clogging up the hospitals, the people that are at high risk are over the age of 65, most of them over even 75 and into their 80s, and they're not working. They're not really part of the workforce anymore. So what's the point of mandating the workforce when it's the retired people who are clogging up the hospitals? But, nothing makes sense these days. So bars, they found, was where there was a lot of spread. I know that's really bad news for the bar owners because a lot of bar owners were hit really, really hard with this, and they don't want to hear that sort of thing. But overall, the study says lockdowns are ill-advised. We just shouldn't be doing them. They didn't really work. It wasn't worth it. People should assess their own risk and decide for themselves. Now, what's really interesting about the study is that they actually compared it to Sweden. So remember this, everybody was saying Sweden is a disaster. Sweden is a problem. Oh my gosh, look at Sweden, the libertarians' dream. We should not do what Sweden's doing. And Johns Hopkins, what they did was they looked at the countries that did a lot for lockdowns and they compared that to countries who did a little. So they didn't do a comparison of doing nothing compared to locking down. They looked at lockdowns compared to doing less. Sweden did less. So they looked at the data from Sweden. They looked at the data from the rest of the Nordic nations. A lot of people said, well, look at all the other Nordic nations and look at their death rates and look at how well they've done comparatively. So Sweden is a disaster. Well, they looked at all the data. This is Johns Hopkins. They looked at the data. And they also said, we're not going to look at the COVID-19 mortality rates. We're going to look at the excess mortality rates, they said, because that is actually going to give you a full picture because every country reports COVID-19 deaths differently. So they looked at the actual excess mortality. They compared lockdown countries to countries like Sweden, and they specifically named Sweden, and they found did no good, not much, wasn't worth it. And it was had real terrible effects on society that apparently Sweden was sheltered from quite a bit because they had a more they halted the large gatherings. They did encourage people to work from home if they could. They older students, they said, study from home, but younger students still went in. Now, one thing people are saying is, well, people, on their own, because it's a pandemic, maybe they'll wear masks on their own. They'll do all these other things on their own. Well, Sweden, they didn't even wear masks. So they don't have a masking culture in Sweden. They never adopted masking. The only time they required masking in Sweden was and this was later on in the pandemic, they finally started, because of public pressure, they started to require masks on public transit. So that was it for Sweden. Now, they didn't have the same lockdowns that the rest of the world did because Sweden has a different constitution. They ultimately did change their constitution. The politicians voted. They wanted more power. They didn't like that the state epidemiologist was in charge of everything. They wanted to appease the panic. And so the politicians voted and they changed the power structure in Sweden a little bit. The politicians got a bit more power. And that is when we started to see more measures being taken in Sweden. That is when they started to have they did kind of go more, not really lockdowns. They never adopted that, but they did more measures that were more in line with the rest of Europe. Didn't do them any good. It wasn't any more beneficial for them. So Sweden wins. I mean, look, we knew that this was going to happen 2 years in. I was a big proponent of the Swedish method. I always said, this is the way to go. We're not going to be able to outrun this virus. We're not going to be able to get rid of it. You're trying to defeat an invisible enemy. Good luck. This isn't going to work. And not only that, this is going to have terrible ramifications. And people said, no, that is wrong. Sweden is the wrong way. Sweden was the right way. I even said back then, this was 2 years ago, we will know in time. Wait for a few more waves to go through, and then we will look back and we'll see, was Sweden right or was Sweden wrong? And it is coming out now that Sweden was right. So yeah. Now, also in this study, aside from the lockdowns having marginal effects on death rates, the conclusions found that shelter-in-place orders were more effective than lockdowns, but still only reduced COVID mortality by 2.9%. So lockdown was one thing. Shelter-in-place was like, don't kind of telling people, don't go out, don't do things. So they found that it wasn't that much of a difference. So it's other things that help with death rates, probably just people assessing their own risk and then deciding for themselves what they should or should not do. Now, what's interesting about this is that back in 2020, Reuters fact-checked these findings. If you remember this, so this was Washington Times had made this claim before that lockdowns had little to no impact on COVID-19, and this was in 2020. And Reuters fact-checked it and said studies show COVID-19 lockdowns have saved lives, have saved lives. So again, another fact check that now we have to fact check the fact check, and it turns out the fact check wasn't so factual after all. Now, the lockdowns have the study found enormous impacts on economic and social. There was very heavy economic and social costs, and they have contributed, according to the study, to reducing economic activity, raising unemployment, reducing schooling, causing political unrest, contributing to domestic violence, and undermining liberal democracy, says the report. So they said this was a net negative. This was really bad. The working class was pummeled as they were forced to close their businesses and keep their kids at home. So I feel like these lockdowns were an absolute disaster, criminal even in nature. I mean, look, now that we know, I would say they're criminal if we were to do them again, because now we know. And if they try to implement this again, this is a disaster. We know that they don't work. The data is for one, they don't work because they never stop the spread of COVID. So just even what they were intended to do, whether or not they had negative impacts or not, they didn't do what people wanted it to do, which was stop the spread of COVID and reduce deaths. That didn't happen. The spread is still with us today, 2 years later. So it is what it is. But now we know that the severe economic costs, I mean, even in my neighborhood, we still haven't rebuilt. Many of the restaurants are closed down. They were shut down and they never went back to normal. Now, that might have happened anyway if people were afraid and they didn't want to go out there and they weren't going out dining. If people had a choice and it had nothing to do with the government, that probably would have happened to some degree. Businesses would not have survived. But I'm sure that way more businesses failed because of the government rather than just failing on their own. The government shutdowns, especially, here in California, we had stupid shutdowns where restaurants weren't allowed to even have outdoor dining. They weren't even allowed that. Because I know you have to shut everything down. And you remember that debacle where the woman that owned it's called like the Pineapple Saloon or something, and she was set up next to a filming of, I believe, Good Girls. I could have this wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was Good Girls. And she was set up next to them, and she wasn't allowed to have her outdoor dining open at all. She was forced to close completely, but they were allowed while they're filming to have an outdoor dining center right next, only feet away from her restaurant, from her outdoor patio. They were allowed to dine outside because they were filming, but she wasn't allowed to open up her restaurant. And it made absolutely zero sense. But that has been the name of the game during this pandemic. A lot of stuff has not made any sense whatsoever. I'm going to toot my own horn for a couple of minutes. Now, in April 12th of 2020, I've always been against the lockdowns. If you've been familiar with my channel from the beginning of this pandemic, I've always been against the lockdowns. I've always been against the mandates from the very beginning. I never had to flip my stance on this. This is a clip from a show I did April 12th, 2020. Here it is. You want to talk about money? Opening the economy isn't about helping Wall Street or benefiting capitalists. People have it backward. Keeping it closed is allowing the banks and investors to squeeze any and every last ounce of financial freedom we might have had away from us. The longer these lockdowns go on, the smaller the middle class and the larger the welfare class becomes. Food banks can't keep up with the demand from hungry Americans. Unemployment has skyrocketed. We are not talking about a recession. We are talking about a depression. We are talking about millions upon millions upon millions of Americans being enslaved to the banks in indentured servitude. The rich will only get richer. They have the extra capital to buy up your sold stocks for dirt cheap, buy up your foreclosed home for dirt cheap, and buy up your closed down small business for dirt cheap. All sold or lost because you desperately needed money to get you through this. That is capitalism, folks. It's a system where people who have the extra money to invest during economic downturns run off richer. Yeah, well, I wish I was wrong about that. Unfortunately, we are headed into potentially dark economic times. I know the economists they believe that we're on the brink of a recession, hopefully not worse. Hopefully things won't crash and become a depression, but we never know how bad things are going to get. We have increasing inflation. It's bad out there right now. And there have been a lot of different other ramifications as well from everything, including record-breaking drug overdoses, a worsened crime rate wave, a delay in life-saving medical treatments. We've got a lot of problems on our hands right now, and a lot of this can be traced back to these measures that, were probably in the beginning, they had good intentions. They unfortunately resulted in where we're at right now with no real benefit. It was just a net loss, and that's very tragic. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Thank you for being here. If you have any questions, comments, please email me, kim@kimiversen.com. Love seeing you here. Those of you who've been with me from the beginning of the pandemic, even when I was saying these lockdowns are a bad idea, and everybody else that was kind of in my political sphere at the time was saying, no, you're wrong, Kim. These lockdowns are all, you wanting to open the economy, Kim, you are a shill for Wall Street. And I was saying, no, guys, you have it the other way around. Unfortunately, Wall Street will win because of these lockdowns. Many people ran away from me at that time saying, Kim, you've lost it. You're crazy. Those of you that stuck around, thank you. Those of you who are back, thank you. Those of you who are new and you've never saw any of that, thank you for being here. Thank you so much for watching the show. Thank you for being here on my YouTube channel. It's been 3 years now since I launched the show. And those of you who are watching on Rumble or Rockfin, thank you so much. Those of you who are in my locals community, love seeing you. If you're not in the locals community, would love to see you there. The link is down below. It's more of a casual space. We get together, do live streams, talk about other content as well. So love to see you on locals. Thank you guys so much for watching. Again, I do want to remind you that I do have videos up on my Rumble channel that I do not have on YouTube. So if you're watching on Rumble, thanks for being here. If you're watching on YouTube, go to Rumble, check out this other video that is nowhere to be found except Rumble and Rockfin. So be sure to check that out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Appreciate you. And we'll just march through. We'll march through all of this. We're 2 years into this pandemic. Hopefully it ends soon. Thanks so much for watching.